There is a name that still echoes across the steppes of Central Asia, whispered in the ruins of cities that once gleamed like jewels along the Silk Road. A name that struck terror into the hearts of emperors and sultans, that turned the greatest fortresses of the medieval world into dust, and that built, from nothing, the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. Genghis Khan. Temujin, the universal ruler. In the span of a single lifetime, a boy who was abandoned on the frozen Mongolian steppe, left to starve, left to die, rose to command an army that conquered more territory in 25 years than the Romans conquered in 400. His empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the burning deserts of Persia, and the world would never be the same. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, the greatest war machine the medieval world ever produced, and the civilization that, for better or for worse, connected the world for the first time. To understand the Mongols, you must first understand the steppe, the vast grasslands of Central Asia, stretching from Manchuria in the east to Hungary in the west, are among the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Winters of -40 degrees, summers of blistering heat, no cities, no farms, only endless grass, endless sky, and the wind. The people who survived here were nomads. They lived in felt tents called gurs, what the Russians would later call yurts. They rode horses before they could walk. They herded sheep, goats, cattle, and camels across distances that would stagger a European farmer. And they fought, constantly. The steppe was not one people. It was dozens of tribes, clans, and confederations: Mongols, Merkits, Naimans, Tartars, Karaits, locked in perpetual cycles of alliance, betrayal, and warfare. Raids were a way of life. Kidnapping of women was common. Blood feuds lasted generations. The steppe was Darwinian in the most brutal sense. Only the strong survived. Only the cunning thrived. Into this world, around the year 1162, a boy named Temujin was born to a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. His father, Yasuge, had named him after a Tartar warrior he had recently defeated, a name meaning iron. It was a fitting name for a boy whose life would be forged in suffering. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by Tartars at a feast. The boy returned to find his family abandoned by their clan. His father's followers, unwilling to be led by a child, rode away and left Temujin, his mother Hoylun, and his siblings alone on the steppe with almost nothing. No animals, no protection, no future. For years, the family survived by eating roots, fish, and field mice. It was a life of desperate poverty. Temujin was captured and enslaved by a rival clan, the Taitudes, who locked a wooden kang around his neck. He escaped in the night. He was hunted. He hid in a freezing river with only his face above the water. These years of suffering did not break Temujin. They made him. He learned in the hardest possible school that blood ties meant nothing if they were not earned, that loyalty was the only currency that mattered, that the steppe's ancient system of aristocratic privilege, where a man's worth was determined by his father's name, was a lie. He would build something different, something based on merit, on loyalty, on absolute discipline. Slowly, through a combination of military genius, personal charisma, and ruthless pragmatism, Temujin began to gather followers. He formed a blood brotherhood with a childhood friend named Jamuka. He allied with Togrul, Khan of the powerful Karaites, who had been a sworn brother of his dead father. Over the next 2 decades, Temujin fought his way to supremacy. He defeated the Merkits, who had kidnapped his wife Borta. He broke the Tatars, who had poisoned his father. He turned against Jamuka when their ambitions collided and destroyed him. He shattered the Naimans, the last great rival confederation. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai on the banks of the Onon River, the leaders of every tribe on the Mongolian steppe knelt before Temujin and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler.
A white banner of 9 horsetails was raised to the eternal blue sky. The Mongol nation was born. He was approximately 44 years old, and his conquests had not yet begun. Chapter 2. The War Machine. The army that Genghis Khan built was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not merely an army, it was an entire society organized for war. Every Mongol male between the ages of 15 and 70 was a soldier. The army was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, the famous tumans. These units were composed of men from different tribes deliberately mixed to break old tribal loyalties and forge a new identity. A Mongol soldier's loyalty was not to his clan. It was to his unit, his commander, and above all, to the Khan. The discipline of the Mongol army was absolute. A soldier who retreated without orders was executed. A unit that abandoned a comrade was decimated. But the rewards for valor were equally extraordinary. Captured wealth was distributed with remarkable fairness. Promotions were based on merit, and every warrior knew that he fought not for a distant king, but for the survival and glory of his own people.
The Mongol warrior was, man for man, the finest light cavalryman the world had ever produced. He could ride 60 miles in a day. He could shoot a composite bow with devastating accuracy at full gallop, a feat that European knights, armored to the teeth on their heavy war horses, could not begin to match. Each warrior carried 2 or 3 bows, 60 arrows, a lance, a scimitar, and a lasso. He wore silk undergarments beneath his leather armor, not for luxury, but because silk did not break when pierced by an arrow, wrapping around the arrowhead and making extraction easier. The Mongol horse, small, shaggy, and tough as iron, could survive on grass alone where European war horses required grain. Each warrior rode with a string of 5 or 6 remounts, giving him an endurance that no other cavalry in the world could match. But the genius of the Mongol army was not merely in its riders, it was in its tactics. Genghis Khan and his generals perfected a system of warfare that combined speed, deception, intelligence gathering, and psychological terror into something that no medieval army could withstand. Their battlefield communications were managed through a system of flags, whistling arrows, and mounted couriers that allowed generals to coordinate tens of thousands of riders across miles of open terrain in real time. No European army possessed anything remotely comparable. The Mongols employed elaborate feigned retreats, falling back for days, even weeks, drawing enemies into pursuit before wheeling and annihilating them. They used scouts and spies with a sophistication that would not be matched until the modern era. They sent merchants and diplomats ahead of their armies to gather intelligence on roads, water sources, fortifications, political divisions, and potential traitors. By the time the Mongol army arrived, they often knew more about their enemy's kingdom than their enemy's own generals did. And then there was terror. Genghis Khan understood with cold clarity that the most efficient conquest was one where the enemy surrendered before a single arrow was fired. Cities that submitted peacefully were spared. Their populations were absorbed, their craftsmen put to work, their merchants allowed to trade. But cities that resisted were destroyed utterly. Every man, woman, and child put to the sword. The ruins left as a message to the next city down the road. It was not mindless cruelty. It was calculated strategy, and it worked. After the first few cities fell, the next ones opened their gates. Refugees were deliberately allowed to flee ahead of the army, carrying tales of horror to the next city, the next province, the next kingdom. Fear traveled faster than horses. By the time the Mongol army appeared on the horizon, many cities had already decided that resistance was suicide. Chapter 3. The Wrath of the Khan.
In 1211, Genghis Khan turned his attention south, toward the Jin dynasty of northern China.
The Jin ruled over 60 million people from behind the greatest fortification ever built, the Great Wall. They looked upon the steppe nomads as barbarians. They were catastrophically wrong. The Mongols swept through the passes of the Great Wall like water through a broken dam. They besieged cities the Mongols had never seen before, vast walled metropolises with populations larger than the entire Mongol nation. But Genghis Khan adapted. He recruited Chinese and Jurchen engineers. He learned siege warfare with terrifying speed. By 1215, the Mongols had captured Chengdu, modern-day Beijing. The city burned for a month. The Jin emperor fled south. Northern China, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated regions on earth, was in Mongol hands. But Genghis Khan's most devastating campaign was still to come. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan of 450 merchants was massacred at the city of Otrar on the eastern frontier of the Khwarezmian Empire, the great Islamic superpower that ruled over modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. The Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, had ordered the massacre and refused to make amends. It was the single greatest miscalculation in medieval history. In 1219, Genghis Khan rode west with an army of perhaps 150,000 warriors. What followed was a campaign of annihilation that haunts the Islamic world to this day. The cities of Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, jewels of Islamic civilization, centers of learning and trade and culture for 5 centuries, were systematically reduced to rubble. At Bukhara, Genghis Khan rode his horse into the city's great mosque and declared himself the punishment of God. At Merv, the Mongols reportedly killed over 700,000 people in a single day, a figure that may be exaggerated, but the scale of the slaughter was real. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the largest and most powerful states in the world, ceased to exist in less than 2 years. Shah Muhammad died a fugitive on an island in the Caspian Sea, stripped of everything. His son, Jalaluddin, fought a guerrilla war for years before he too was hunted down. The destruction was so complete that some regions of Central Asia did not recover their pre-Mongol population levels until the 20th century. Irrigation systems that had sustained civilization for millennia were destroyed. Libraries were burned. Scholars were killed. The great centers of Islamic learning fell silent. Chapter 4. The Law of the Steppe. But Genghis Khan was not merely a destroyer. He was also a builder of systems, of laws, of institutions that would hold his empire together long after the conquests ended.
The Yasa, the Great Law, was the legal code that governed the Mongol Empire. It regulated everything from military discipline to trade, from hunting to the treatment of ambassadors. It imposed the death penalty for theft, for desertion, and for failing to help a fellow warrior in battle. It guaranteed religious freedom throughout the empire, a policy remarkable for its time and virtually unique among medieval states. The Yasa reflected Genghis Khan's deepest convictions, forged in the hardship of his youth. Loyalty was sacred. Treachery was the worst of all crimes, even treachery committed in his favor. When enemy soldiers betrayed their own commanders to curry favor with the Mongols, Genghis Khan had them executed. He rewarded those who had fought against him with honor and loyalty, and he punished those who had betrayed their own lords, even when the betrayal benefited the Mongols. He established the Yam, a postal relay system of way stations stretching across the empire, where riders could change horses and carry messages at speeds that would not be matched until the telegraph. A message could travel from the Pacific to the Mediterranean in a matter of weeks. He organized the empire into appanages, vast territorial grants given to his 4 sons by Borte, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. Each would inherit a portion of the empire after his death, but all would serve the great Khan. The empire was a family enterprise, and the family was the state. Chapter 5. The Death of the Conqueror. In August of 1227, On campaign against the Tangut Kingdom of Western Shah, which had refused to supply troops for the Khwarezmian War, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause remains debated. Some sources say he fell from his horse during a hunt. Others claim illness. Some Chinese accounts suggest he was stabbed by a Tangut princess. He was approximately 65 years old. He had conquered more territory than any single human being in history.
His body was carried back to Mongolia in a funeral cortege of terrible solemnity. According to tradition, every living thing encountered along the route was killed to serve the Khan in the afterlife and to ensure that no one could report the location of the burial. He was interred in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Khanty Mountains of northeastern Mongolia. The site has never been found. Before his death, he had named his third son, Ogedei, as his successor. The empire, stretching from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian, was divided among his sons, but Ogedei would be the great Khan, the overlord of all. The question was whether the empire could survive without its founder. Chapter 6. The Empire Expands. The answer, for a time, was yes, spectacularly so. Ogedei Khan proved himself a capable and energetic ruler. He established a permanent capital at Karakorum in central Mongolia, a cosmopolitan city where Christian churches stood beside Buddhist temples and Muslim mosques. He expanded the Yam postal system. He commissioned a census of the entire empire. He drank heavily, a weakness that would cut short his reign, but he governed with intelligence and generosity. Under Ogedei, the conquests continued. In the east, the Mongols completed the destruction of the Jin dynasty in 1234, bringing all of northern China under their permanent control. But it was in the west that the most spectacular campaign unfolded. In 1236, Ogedei dispatched his nephew Batu, son of the late Jochi, with an army of 150,000 warriors to conquer the lands beyond the Volga. The campaign was led in the field by Subotai, perhaps the greatest military commander of the Middle Ages and one of the most gifted generals in all of history. The Mongol army crashed into the Russian principalities like a tidal wave. Ryazan fell in December 1237. Vladimir fell in February 1238. Moscow, then a small wooden town, was burned to the ground. Kiev, the greatest city of the Slavic world, the mother of Russian civilization, was so thoroughly destroyed that a traveler passing through 6 years later counted countless skulls and bones scattered across the landscape. Russia would remain under Mongol domination, the so-called Tartar yoke, for nearly 250 years. The experience shaped Russian civilization in ways that endure to this day. Its autocratic political traditions, its suspicion of the West, its vast territorial ambitions.
But Subotai was not finished. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol army split into 2 columns and invaded Europe simultaneously. The northern column annihilated a combined Polish and German army at the Battle of Legnica on April 9th. The southern column, under Subotai himself, shattered the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi on April 11th. 2 days later, 600 miles apart. It was a feat of coordination that European commanders could not comprehend. Europe lay open. The Mongol vanguard reached the shores of the Adriatic Sea. Panic swept the continent. The Pope called for a crusade. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, prepared to defend what was left of Christendom. And then, in December 1241, Ogedei Khan died, possibly from a combination of heavy drinking and overindulgence at a feast. Mongol law required all princes of the blood to return for the election of a new great Khan. Batu turned his army around and rode east. Europe was saved by a hangover. The Mongols never returned to Central Europe. The westernmost permanent boundary of their empire would remain at the Volga. Chapter 7. Kublai and the Zenith.
The succession crises that followed Ogedei's death revealed the fundamental weakness of the Mongol system. The empire was a family enterprise, and the family was increasingly at war with itself. Ogedei's widow, Torgine, ruled as regent. Ogedei's son Guyuk briefly reigned before dying under suspicious circumstances. Finally, in 1251, the line of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, seized the throne. Mongol Khan, Tolui's eldest son, became Great Khan. He was the last ruler to hold the entire Mongol Empire together as a functioning unit. He dispatched his brother Hulagu to conquer the Islamic heartland and his brother Kublai to finish the conquest of China. In 1258, Hulagu's army descended upon Baghdad, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual center of Sunni Islam and one of the largest and most cultured cities in the world. The siege was swift and merciless. The caliph was captured and, according to tradition, rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses because Mongol custom forbade spilling royal blood upon the ground. The libraries of Baghdad, repositories of centuries of Islamic scholarship, Greek philosophy, Persian literature, were thrown into the Tigris. The river, it was said, ran black with ink and red with blood. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for 5 centuries, was extinguished in a single week. But Hulagu's advance was halted at Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1260, where the Egyptian Mamluks inflicted the first major defeat on a Mongol army in open battle. It was a turning point. The Mongol tide had reached its high watermark in the west.
Meanwhile, in the east, Kublai Khan was building something different. After Mongke died in 1259, Kublai fought a civil war against his brother, Arik Bokeh, for the title of Great Khan, a war that shattered the fiction of Mongol unity forever. Kublai won, but the Western Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, became effectively independent states. Kublai Khan moved the Mongol capital from Karakoram to a new city he built in northern China, Khanbalik, the city of the Khan, which the world would come to know as Beijing. He completed the conquest of the Sung dynasty in 1279, unifying all of China under a single ruler for the first time in centuries. He proclaimed a new dynasty, the Yuan, and styled himself not as a steppe conqueror, but as a Chinese emperor. His court was a wonder of the medieval world. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who claimed to have spent 17 years in Kublai's service, described palaces of marble and gold, a postal system that spanned a continent, paper money that functioned as a national currency, and a city of such splendor that no European had ever imagined its like. Chapter 8. The Fall. Kublai Khan died in 1924, old and fat, and grieving for his favorite wife and his chosen heir, both of whom had predeceased him. After his death, the Yuan dynasty stumbled from crisis to crisis. His successors were weak. The Chinese population, which had never accepted Mongol rule willingly, grew restive. Famine, plague, and floods ravaged the countryside. In the 1340s, the Black Death, the bubonic plague that may have originated in the Mongol heartland, swept along the trade routes of the empire and devastated Eurasia. The Mongol peace that had made transcontinental trade possible had also created the highway along which the deadliest pandemic in human history traveled. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. In 1368, a Chinese rebel named Zhu Yuanzhang, a former monk and beggar, drove the last Yuan emperor from Beijing and proclaimed the Ming dynasty. The Mongols retreated to the steppe from which they had come. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had collapsed decades earlier. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented. Only the Golden Horde endured, ruling Russia until the late 15th century, when Ivan III of Moscow finally threw off the Tartar yoke. By the end of the 14th century, The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, had ceased to exist. But the legacy endured. The Mongols had connected the world. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had opened trade routes from China to Europe for the first time, carrying silk, spices, ideas, technologies, and diseases across the breadth of Eurasia. Gunpowder, the printing press, the compass, technologies that would transform Europe, traveled westward along Mongol roads. The Mongol Empire was a paradox, the most destructive force the medieval world had ever known, and yet also one of the most transformative. Tens of millions died in the conquests. Entire civilizations were erased. But in the ruins, a new world was born, a world where East and West were no longer strangers, where the Silk Road hummed with commerce, where a letter written in Beijing could reach Paris. Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, would claim the Mongol inheritance a generation later, building a brief and brilliant empire from Samarkand. The Mughals of India traced their lineage to Genghis Khan through Timur's line. The Crimean Khanate, a successor state of the Golden Horde, endured until 1783, outliving the Mongol Empire by 4 centuries. Genghis Khan's empire did not last. No empire does. But the world it created, interconnected, globalized, and forever changed, is the world we still live in today. The hoofbeats have faded, but the echoes remain.